Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to another episode of the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast with me, your host, Harry Symeou. We're going to do something a little bit different today. I don't know about you, but I'm sick of reading the same news cycle, hearing the same reports, the same stories with very little in terms of updated information. That's where we're at the moment. At the time of recording, we're still waiting to learn whether Arsenal are going to find a breakthrough with Sporting for Victor Gyökeres. We're all pretty confident that eventually that deal will happen, but it hasn't happened up until now, and that has led to widespread frustration. Arsenal are on their pre-season tour, and we'd have all preferred for Victor Gyökeres to be involved in that. So I get why there is that kind of irritation among the fan base. I sort of woke up this morning, and Tuesdays is the Athletics transfer deal sheet day, but even reading through that this morning, there wasn't a great deal different to what we've already been talking about. And it feels like we've exhausted so many of those topics over the course of the last few weeks that I'd just be repeating myself if we went over them again. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do something different. We're going to talk Mikel Arteta. I'm going to let you guys know 3 things I think Mikel Arteta must do better in this upcoming season if Arsenal are to go from challengers to winners. Now, this is my opinion, and obviously there will be things that some people agree with, and there'll be others that people disagree with. But this is my view. This is what I think the boss could do better. We talk a lot about transfers, and we talk a lot about players coming in and how they would improve us and how we need them and how they would change the dynamic of the squad and all the rest of it. But for me, there are some things that the manager could do that I think would put us in a better position. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert or to know more than the great Mikel Arteta. Of course, I'm not. But there are certain things that, looking back on last season, I think he could have handled better. And I think actually had some sort of impact on the way our season ended up panning out. Right then, let's get into it. I want to make it very, very clear that I am one of Mikel Arteta's biggest fans. Okay, I think the job that he's done at Arsenal Football Club to take it from where it was to where it is today, and to put us into a position where we, as fans, go into seasons expecting to be crowned Premier League champions, expecting to go far in Europe's premier competition, and we're at a point where anything less than that feels like a disappointment and feels like a failure. And that says so much about the journey the club's been on. So I'm not sitting here trying to kind of pick holes in Mikel Arteta because I think he's done a bad job, but there's always room for improvement, right? And I'm just sharing my view and my opinion on what I think he could do somewhat better to turn Arsenal, as I said earlier, from challengers to winners. So let's get into number 1. Number 1 is squad management / rotation. I think Mikel Arteta has to get much better at that. There are other coaches out there, I feel, who do that far, far better than Mikel, who I feel find that balance between making sure that the team is strong enough for the opponent that they're up against on that particular occasion, who, take those risks to a degree, but are obviously confident in the ability of their squad to get them over the line and help them through those situations. But I also think sometimes rotation is a very, very tight rope to walk, isn't it? Because 1 minute, you can over rotate, meaning that you've caused way too much disruption to the team, meaning that you've changed 6, 7 players and the team now has no flow, no rhythm whatsoever. Or you can under rotate, whereby, yes, the team is still at a very high level and you limit that disruption, but then you are working players who probably could do with the rest into the ground. And sometimes that will happen because you probably don't trust fully in your squad players. I feel like Mikel Arteta for a while was sort of trusted 13, 14 players, but it's never really stretched too far beyond that. And that has been a problem for us. It's no coincidence that we had an injury crisis last season. Of course, there was an element of rotten luck to that. And of course, you could manage everybody to perfection in the eyes of the world, but still end up suffering with multiple injuries. It's modern football. It's the calendar. There's so many other factors outside of Arsenal and Mikel Arteta's control that, of course, contribute to this. But I do feel like when you end up losing Saka, who we've been talking about for such a long time as a player that needed protection, when you lose Gabriel, who had played pretty much every game, when you lose Kai Havertz, who, when available, plays pretty much every single game, and you lose them to very, very serious injuries. We lost Martin Odegaard as well early in the season, a player that we talked about as being someone who's there all the time and probably needed a bit of protection and cover too. Look, when you go through the list of players and you look at the severity of those injuries, it's impossible, I think, to ignore the fact that they probably were overworked and that there were games in which those players featured that they just didn't need to. You know, I think back to that game we played against Preston in the Carabao Cup away from home. And I remember it really well because I commentated on that particular game. And I remember looking at it and thinking, we made some changes in the second half and we brought certain players on. And I remember looking at it and going, did we need to bring these guys on? Like, could the fringe players have not have finished the game? Like, did we need to make those changes? And I know nobody got directly injured in that game, but that was just an example of where we are exposing key players to minutes that they simply don't need to be exposed to. I understand why, if you're expected to compete on multiple fronts, and if you don't believe in the real depth of your squad, you are going to make that decision as a manager. But when you look at what we're doing in the transfer window right now, and if you think about the signings we've made so far, at the time of recording, we've got Kepa in, we've got Norgard in, we've got Zubimendi in, we've got Madueke in. We're probably going to get Gyökeres in as well. Have I forgot someone? I feel like I've forgot someone. Mosquera's coming in as well. We'd be building out the squad, right? Because of those players, it's probably only going to be Zubimendi and Gyökeres that come into the starting 11. So what we're doing this summer is we're building out the squad, but that means that Mikel will no longer have the excuse of, I don't have the depth. And at some point, he's got to change his mindset a little bit and think, look, I want to protect my players, but I also want to make sure that we're competitive and we're as strong as we can possibly be so that we can go and win that bit of silverware that everybody's banging on about, that I need really to kind of keep the Wolves away from my door as far as some of the supporters are concerned. But you've got to find that balance between being strong enough, trusting in your squad to step up when they need to, and protecting those key players. That is really, really important. And I don't think it's something that Mikel has quite nailed just yet. He's nailed a lot of things. He's done brilliantly in his first job, and he's taken Arsenal to a wonderful place, to a far better place than he found the club in. But this is one of the areas I think he clearly needs to improve in. So number one is squad management and rotation. Number two for me is to do with our style of play. I think he has to find the balance, and balance being the key word of today's pod, between the organization that has seen us become one of the meanest defensive units and a team that are no longer a soft touch, and allowing players to break out of the structure and affording them the freedom that they need to go out and beat teams, break down low blocks, take people apart, because I feel like sometimes that rigidness and that very clear structure and alignment that he's coached and drilled into this team for such a long time, that, as I've mentioned, has its real positives and has its real benefits, has also been a negative in that when we need to break out of that structure, when we need players to be that little bit more spontaneous and free, they've seemed to find it hard to flick the switch from one to the other. And I think that is down to perhaps at times being overcoached. I think that the players have found it difficult to vary it up. I think the players have found it difficult to break down low blocks, partly because of this, but it's largely down to personnel too. But again, that, if you want to try and get to the root cause, I think does come back to the manager and those in charge of recruitment at the football club, because I don't believe that we've signed enough of that spontaneous type. I don't believe that we've got enough of those types of players, because we are obviously focused on the system, the collective, the unit. That's why we went out and signed people like Calafiori, who, to be fair to him, does break the mold, but is your archetypal Mikel Arteta fullback. He's really a centre-back, but he's been turned into a fullback. It's why we signed Mikel Merino, because he can play in that left 8 role and ticks all the boxes that Mikel wants. It's probably why we signed Kai Havertz, although his use has turned out to be quite different. It's why Gabriel Martinelli is in the team all the time, even when he's lacking at times that end product and he's unable to make the right decisions in the final third because of all the other things he gives you and how he props up and supports and helps the structure of the team. At some point, though, you got to find that balance and you've got to be able to flick a switch and, yes, maintain that defensive core. And maybe the defensive midfielder needs to be a little bit more disciplined than everybody else. And although we do push our 8s on, sometimes our movement in the final third can be a little bit predictable. And if we give those players, if Mikel Arteta gives those players a bit more license to be able to break out of the structure, to be able to take the ball on themselves, gives them that confidence, empowers them, if you like, to do so, then I think Arsenal become much more unpredictable in the final third and therefore should have a lot more joy when it comes to breaking down those low blocks. I keep talking about Mikel's role in this because I do think it is a big one. But again, I do think that the players that we have restrict us in this sense. And I think that's probably something that over the course of their analysis, when looking back at the 24-25 season, Mikel Arteta and his coaching staff have picked up on. And the reason I say that is because they've gone out and signed Noni Madueke, a player that for me is the opposite of that. Someone who, will stay in his starting position when you're out of possession and will be there when you first win the ball back, but is very, very keen to go drifting, is very, very keen to come in field, is very, very keen to take people on the outside if he likes, and is almost very, very direct in his thinking. If you look at Noni Madueke when he picks the ball up on that wide right, he'll normally either take you on the outside if he feels that's where the space is and that's where the best place to go is. But a lot of the time, he's a bit like Bukayo Saka in that it's, right, how can I get as close to the penalty spot as possible? In fact, I would argue that sometimes he's more direct than Bukayo Saka. And being direct and being willing to dribble and being willing to take people on, it attracts the attention of defenders. It creates space for others. Also, the fact that we haven't had an out-and-out centre forward, I think, has contributed to this because when your false 9 keeps dropping deeper, it allows teams to pack out those central areas. And then when you try and make those runs from deep, which is inevitably what we do because we don't have that focal point or that player camped on the edge of the 6-yard box, there's nowhere to go. It's congested. They've got the bodies back to pick up those runs. Keeping a centre forward camped on the edge of the 6-yard box when you're building up or around the penalty spot when you're trying to build up, that gives you a totally different dynamic. And Arsenal have clearly recognized, better late than never, some would say, that actually they need that type of centre forward to give us that variety to our attacking play. So I think for me, it's about the players, but it's also about Mikel and his coaching style. And what we seem to do is drill players so brilliantly that defensively we're fantastic and we're tough to beat and we're tough to break down. And when we score the first goal, you would back us, wouldn't you? A lot of the time nowadays, almost like the George Graham days, to kind of sit behind the ball, soak up if we have to. And we've shown that over the last few years. We've put in some really brilliant defensive displays. But in the final third, when we need to break down low blocks, sometimes, in my opinion, we lack that spontaneity. And as I say, it comes down to partly the personnel, but partly because we are very rigid in our system. We are very, well drilled and well coached. But when something is really properly drilled into you, it can be difficult to break out of that mold and do something a little bit different. It's like when we talk about players coming off the bench. And look, the bench has been a problem here as well. The bench has often been short, partly because of what we mentioned in section 1 about squad rotation and player management, then contributing to more injuries. And the more injuries you have, the thinner your squad looks. The thinner your squad looks, the less options you have from the bench. And the less possible it is to kind of change the game midway through via sort of turning to players on the bench and throwing them on into different scenarios and different situations. But I think Mikel has played a part in Arsenal at times looking a little bit overcoached and looking a little bit devoid of ideas. It has its benefits, as I keep saying. I don't want to underplay that, but I think we need to find again that balance. Balance is the key because I think Mikel's got some really great attributes as a manager and as a coach, but balance in certain areas is just what we're missing. Let's move on then to number three, the third and final critique I have of Mikel Arteta and what I think he needs to do better going into the 25-26 season. This might seem like a bit of a non-issue to some people, but I really do strongly believe that Mikel Arteta has to learn to manage his post-match emotions better. Now, one of the things that drew me to Mikel Arteta when we first appointed him as a coach was what a great communicator he is. And when you go to his pre-match press conferences, I think he's brilliant. Okay. I know that some people take issue with some of the things he says. Some people don't necessarily agree with the things he says. Some people don't like the things he says. But I think as far as communicators go, when Mikel Arteta is in good form, he's in brilliant form. And I think he is very, very convincing. Okay, I think that's why we've managed to land a lot of players over the years that maybe had interest from elsewhere. I think it's why he's seemingly been able to convince the club to invest a little bit more money than maybe they would have liked from a purely business perspective over the last few years. I think he's very, very convincing, and that is largely down to his brilliant communication style. But post match, he's very, very emotional, especially when we haven't got the result that we want. And listen, that's what winners react like. Okay. Nobody enjoys losing. And if you did enjoy losing, if he came out all smiles after damaging and disappointing defeats, I'd be the first person to sit here and say, come on, show a bit of emotion and a bit of want for this and a bit of passion, etc., etc. But I think at times that emotion has spilled over into being what can be perceived as delusion. And this is where I have a bit of an issue with Mikel's post-match reactions. Listen, I've interviewed him many, many times after a game for the radio, and I'm extremely lucky to do that. And there have been times where I thought he's been brilliant, and there have been times where I thought he clearly didn't want to be in the room, mostly after bad results, and he wanted to get out the door as quick as possible. And I get that, right? Because me as a fan, I'm frustrated when we've lost. I'm frustrated when we haven't got the result we wanted. I can't imagine how it must feel if you spent months and months and months planning something, put in all the hard graft in, and then you see maybe a player go out there and let you down. Maybe the players as a collective let you down. Maybe a refereeing decision have a real big impact. Maybe injuries cost you. I get it, right? I get it. I'm not criticizing the man for being emotional. I think you have to be in that job. But I think one of the things that kind of really started to grind on my gears last season, and I've said this before, it's not a secret, and I'm not afraid to voice this opinion, is this kind of constant want to justify our performances, even when they weren't good enough, and this want to make it clear that we were, in his words, the dominant side. Dominant in terms of what? Dominant in terms of possession, maybe. Dominant in terms of territory, quite possibly. But in a lot of those instances, we failed to create an adequate amount of chances, clear cut chances to win a game of football. And that is a problem that we have. And I'm not saying that internally they won't recognize that or understand that. But for me, it was incredibly frustrating after certain games last season to hear the manager come out and say, we were brilliant. I'm so proud of my players. We were excellent. We were totally dominant, blah, 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 blah. But then to overlook the fact that we either couldn't create chances or finish them, which is ultimately the most important part of the game, right? If you can't be potent, if you can't be effective in the final third, then what you do in the defensive third and in the middle third, it's not quite as important, is it? It's not quite as relevant. And I feel like there were a few examples of that last season where I came away and I just went, we're smarter than that. You know, we're smarter than that as fans and as supporters. And we can clearly see that there's a creativity issue or that there's a striker issue. And I'm not saying that you're going to throw your players under the bus, but I don't think you need to go as big on the whole. We dominated and we were by far the better team thing as Mikel has at times. And the time that really kind of irritated me, and I get it because we were all incredibly emotional. I was lucky enough to be there. We were out in Paris for the second leg against Paris Saint-Germain. We put in an admirable performance against undoubtedly the best club side in the world, despite what Chelsea would tell you. Um, having beaten them in a glorified preseason friendly. Um, they are the best team in Europe. I said that after the first 20 minutes of the first leg. I've been saying that they were quite possibly up there, watching the way that they got rid of Liverpool and the way that they dispatched of others in the competition. But we came away from the Parc des Princes having given a good account of ourselves and obviously heartbroken and very, very disappointed that we'd lost a semi-final and we'd missed the opportunity to reach a European Cup final for the first time since 2006. Of course, there was disappointment. Of course, there was frustration. But to come out and say that we were the better team over the two legs when, we might have been the better team in certain elements and certain aspects. But again, you're failing to overlook the most important part of the game, which is sticking the ball in the back of the net. That's what wins you football matches, not possession in the middle third, not possession in your defensive third. That's what does it. And in that second leg, we created chances. We had some chances in the first leg as well that we ought to have done better with. And really, we should have gone to Paris at least on level terms. But I just wanted to see my manager at that time just acknowledge what a wonderful team PSG are and were over the course of those two legs. And I think the fans would have responded with perhaps more sadness than frustration had that been his narrative. Because his narrative was, we were the better team, it was kind of like, what's the matter with you? We weren't. Like, we weren't. Anybody that was watching that could see that Kvaratskhelia and Dembele and Doué, for instance, were delivering magic in the final third on a level that we just could not get close to in terms of creativity and spark. Our chances were coming from long throw-ins and all the rest of it. And listen, if that's what works for you, you do it. I haven't got a problem with it. But this denial that seemed to be put across from Mikel Arteta post that match, it really, really frustrated me. And that was the perfect example of where I think he needs to keep a lid on his emotions. In a situation like that, where you're beaten fair and square, you've got to be able to control it. And actually, you make yourself far more likable if you speak in a more humble way and you're a little bit more honest and a little bit more measured. That then means, I think, that you get an easier ride from the wider media, and that in turn can help shake the narrative around you. I think when you come out and say stuff like that, people are like, well, this guy's deluded. Let's wind him up. Let's have a good old laugh. Let's poke fun at him. Let's write hit pieces about him because actually he's a really sore loser. That's how it came across. And I think that, and it used to happen with Wenger as well, I think it impacts on us as a football club because the perception of us as a football club is largely shaped by what the manager says a lot of the time. And so we got to be really, really careful with that. I think that's something he's got to learn. When he came out after the Newcastle game a couple of seasons ago and called it an absolute disgrace and all of that, I was fully behind him because I felt it was justified on that day to really go in and go in hard. After PSG, I think we needed to have a little bit of humble pie. We needed to take it on the chin. We needed to accept that we had been beaten by a better side over two legs. And I think we needed to talk about the brilliance of the journey, the fact that we'd overcome Real Madrid, that we'd got to this point in only our second season back in the Champions League. And we should be really, really proud of that and talk about how it hurts at the time and it hurts in this moment, but we'll go again, we'll learn from it. I wanted to hear that as a fan. I know people will say that that's a load of old cliches being rolled out, but I genuinely wanted to hear that rather than hearing that we were the better team when we clearly weren't. And I get that emotion took over, and I get that emotion dominated and ultimately led to Mikel Arteta saying what he said. And I love that he cares that deeply. But I think you got to be smarter than that in the way that you put yourself across when talking to the world's media, as you are after a Champions League semi-final. He came across as a little bit delusional. So I think that's something that he needs to improve on as well. I don't want to take the passion away from him. I don't want to clip his wings in that sense. But I think he needs to be mindful of what he's saying after a really emotive occasion like that, an emotive result. So, yeah, let me just summarize. 3 things I think that Mikel Arteta needs to do better going into the 2025-26 season. Squad rotation / management. We've got to find that balance when it comes to rotation between over rotation and under rotation. We need to protect the right players at the right times. We need to stop running people into the ground. And in theory, with a bigger And in theory, better squad, we should be able to do that more effectively. So, given the business that we've done and the business that we think we're going to do between now and the end of the window, I fully expect to see an improvement on that side of things. Yeah, I think he has to find a better balance between the organizational side of things and the structure that we have on the pitch I'm talking about versus allowing people to break out of that, to be free, to be spontaneous, and to go out and express themselves. Because I think that would help us in breaking down low blocks and dealing with stubborn defensive opposition. And number three, I think he's got to manage his emotions post match a little bit better, because I think when you come across, as he did, I thought, after PSG, as a bit of a sore loser, and as someone that was maybe watching a different game to a lot of other people, I think you end up creating a sort of sinister narrative around yourself, and a narrative that encourages people to pile onto you. And I don't think that's the greatest management of the press. Now, he'll say, I don't care about the press. I don't care about the media. I care about my team. I care about being successful. And yes, that's important. But in this day and age, I think you do need to manage that a little bit better. So those are the three things I think Mikel Arteta must do better this season. That's not to say I want him out. That's not to say I don't like the work that he's done so far. That's not to say I don't think he's the right man to continue taking Arsenal forward. I think he's done a brilliant job, and I'm fully team Mikel Arteta still. But those are the things that I picked up on last season that I think we could do better. He could do better, and I think would in turn help Arsenal to do better. But who am I? It's just my opinion. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the podcast. Don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you're watching us on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please do leave us a review. And if you fancy supporting me to deliver you daily Arsenal content, then go over to our Patreon page. There are links in the description to all our latest Patreon videos, where we've done some video analysis on some of the players that we've been linked with and have already signed. Go and check that out. Your support is very much appreciated. Not a live episode today, so no live Q&A. But if you've got questions, get them in the comment section below, and we'll pick them up as part of our long, lengthy watch-along program that we'll be doing of Arsenal's game against AC Milan out in Singapore tomorrow. So we can kick it off by doing a Q&A. That'll take us nicely up to kickoff. Maybe we can pick up some more during halftime as well. And then we're going to bring you the podcast on Wednesday at a later time of about 3 p.m. Because what we're going to do is we're going to do our watch along. Then we're going to record a podcast where we reflect on the game, and that will go out to all our listeners on Spotify and Apple. If you are an audio listener only and you fancy joining us for the watch along, you'll need to come over to the YouTube channel. We'll take you through the game, every kick, loose commentary of the game, while we'll be discussing some of the key themes and takeaways from it. So if you're at work, I think it'll be ideal, because you might not be able to sit and watch the game. Well, I'll take you through it. I am a commentator after all. At least I try to be. Anyway, thank you all so much. I'll see you all on the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves and have a wonderful day.